So welcome everyone. My name is Brett Thielen. I'm the Science Director at the Harris Center for Conservation Education, and we are hosting tonight's talk along with the Peterborough Conservation Commission. We are a nonprofit organization based in the Monadnock region of Southwest New Hampshire. We help people fall in love with the natural world through land protection, conservation research, and environmental education. So those of you who are local, I hope will be excited to know that we've protected more than 24,000 acres of land from development. Much of that is open for hiking, birding, pollinator watching, and other recreation. We coordinate conservation research on our protected lands and throughout the region, including a number of really fun community science projects where volunteers help us collect data on wildlife. We have some pollinator focused projects coming up this summer. And then at the heart of everything we do is education for all ages, from babies in backpacks to residents of retirement communities, and really all points in between. Every year we have nearly 150 programs, everything from birding outings to talks like this one. Or one last bit is that none of what we do would be possible without our supporters. And I know some of you are out there, so I always like to thank you for your support. And if you are new to us, I really encourage you to check us out. We have so much going on and so much to learn. So now on to the good stuff, which is getting to introduce our speaker. And is really truly an honor for me to get to introduce Francie Von Mertens, who is a force of nature and a force for nature in her own right, has been involved in so many conservation projects and conservation organizations in the Monadnock region and beyond for decades. I asked her for a bio and she didn't mention any of that, but I really think it's important because she's a conservation hero for me and many others in this region. She's also a longtime volunteer with the Harris Center, including helping to plan our pollinator garden around 7 years ago, which is, she says, an exciting learning process that continues. And her interest in the natural world began with birds, and that expanded to their world and beyond, including plants and most recently their pollinators. She does volunteer not just with the Harris Center, but with several conservation groups on behalf of the wild ones and the natural world that we share. And as she often says or writes, because she's also an accomplished writer, we're all in this together. And I think we're going to learn more about that tonight. So with that, take it away, Francie.
It's wonderful to be here to focus on native bees, the wild ones that have been getting the pollination job done for a long time before the very celebrated honeybee arrived. And native bees are slowly emerging from the shadow of honeybees. So that's what I'm about. Here's an iconic apple orchard, New England, very familiar. There's 7 wild native bees at work here. A study of apple orchards found over 100 native bees pollinate our apple orchards, and there's over 200 native bee species in New Hampshire. This is the blue orchard bee. She's been working a bit. You can see pollen grains on her. She's got a big, I call them saddlebags, filled with nectar and pollen. And that's what they're all doing. And they're going to take it back to their nests and they'll create a pollen ball. They'll lay an egg on it. The egg hatched, here's the larva or the caterpillar. And that's why they're all at work here. A study determined that 250 blue orchard bees can pollinate 1 acre of apple trees. And so picture an acre. A logical question might be, how many honeybees would it take to do the same thing? And it's a task needing 1.5 to 2 honeybee hives. And a follow-up question to that is, how many honeybees are in a hive? And there are about 50,000. So that's pretty hard to believe. 250 blue orchard bees equivalent to 50,000 honeybees. Very hard to believe. So we're going to spend about a half hour, 45 minutes finding out how that can be. But first of all, why the focus on pollinators? A good majority of all plants, flowering plants, require pollination by animals to reproduce, and there's an asterisk there. What kind of animals? Mostly native bees. So I'm establishing a theme here. The remainder, most trees and grasses, are wind pollinated, tiny grains of pollen cast to the winds. And they're the ones that make us sneeze, get into our eyes and nose and lungs. Pollen that animals transport are big grains. They're not allergenic. Humans are the usual focus, 1/3 of what we eat and drink. You thank pollinators for. I think most of us have heard that. However, the broader context, beyond humans, the living, functioning, natural landscape beyond the supermarket. Anything that flowers must be pollinated to produce nuts, fruits, berries, and seeds that produce the next generation. Why the focus on pollinators? I think we all know this. They're in serious decline. So one thing to get out of the way quickly, if you research bees on the internet, the first thing you come up with is extermination, pest control websites, and that's where this illustration came from. But most native bees and most native wasps, they don't sting. Most wasps and native bees are solitary. They're not communal. They don't have a hive. They're not social. If you're near a nest or a hive, beware. There's guard bees and guard wasps, and they very likely will come after you. They're defending the colony and its queen and the food source within. So evolution, I'll be talking about evolution, which is pretty cool. And the first bees appeared soon after the first flowers appeared, about 125 million years ago. And they actually split off from carnivorous wasps. So all bees share a common wasp ancestor. Flowers have diversified ever since to entice vegetarian bees with pollen, which is protein, and nectar, carbohydrates. And bees have diversified, they've kept up, all the better to be engineered to access food resources. We all knew this at one time, but here's a quick review. There's the male anther pollen producers. There's 4 on this particular flower, little pollen or large pollen grains. The female part is a stigma. Pollen delivered to the stigma, become sperm cells, go down a tube into the ovary where the eggs are fertilized. Very familiar vocabulary that we share with bees. So here's an important distinction: a plant pollinator and a plant visitor. So when you hear about pollinators, you hear about butterflies, hummingbirds, moths, wasps, bats, bugs, beetles, flies, and some others. They're visitors mostly. They're only interested in nectar, not pollen. And you can see this tiger swallowtail with a long proboscis. She's drinking nectar, and she'll move on to another flower, maybe of a different kind. Whoops, sorry. Plant visitors mostly. They all have an ecological role, but not as key pollinators. And there are notable exceptions, and one of them is the chocolate midge. It's a tiny no-see-um, and it's pretty much the only pollinator of the cacao tree. Very hairy, and so it's drinking nectar, and inadvertently it collects pollen on its very hairy body, which it has in common with bees. And it goes on to the next cacao blossom, and inadvertently pollen gets delivered and pollination begins. The top pollinators are, and I think you can finish this sentence, the bees. Here's a bumblebee queen that's just emerged from hibernation. I think you recognize this flower as an early blooming one. It's a crocus. She's been in hibernation for 6, 7, 8 months. She emerges quite hungry. She's got to restore her energy levels. Pollen early in the season is important. Besides a food reward of nectar and pollen, flowers, some are scented to attract pollinators. Some have certain colors. Bees see blue really well. They're quite attracted to blue. Others have directional, this is another crocus, directional like landing lights. Here's where the food is, just helping guide the bee to the food reward. Those of a certain age, I think, know Hal Borland. He had wonderful nature essays in the New York Times for decades. And this is a quote from one of his essays. They're collected in books, highly recommended. The Crocus and the Bee. He wrote, "Cider and apple jelly will be ours because a bumblebee found a crocus in bloom in April." And he wrote that it was a bumblebee queen. He knew his nature well. And she will take pollen nectar back to her nest, create the pollen balls, lay eggs on them, larvae will develop, and the first brood will take flight when apple trees need to be pollinated. So there's full circle there. Why are bees such good pollinators? I just touched on the fact that they're hairy. However, it's more than that. Their bodies are electrostatically charged. They're positively charged by wing whir. And flowers and pollen are negatively charged. And so that helps pollen get attracted to the bees' hairy bodies. Pollen baskets, I call them, they have a more formal name, on hind legs carry a lot of pollen, up to 80% the weight of this bumblebee she can carry. So that's less time commuting to the nest, back and forth, and more time pollinating. Flower constancy, true of bees much more than that eastern-tailed, what was it, the butterfly we saw earlier on. Foraging bees generally focus on one plant species at a time. It's very efficient. Here's a lupin growing along the roadside north of Conval High School here in Peterborough. So this bumblebee will go from lupin to lupin. 25% of native bees are specialists. They're able to digest pollen from a limited range of native plants, a particular maybe within a genus. And that's another way that directs or increases the percentage of pollination, the right pollen going to the right plant. There's a lot of goldenrod. There's a lot of goldenrod specialist bees in late summer, and they and their young can only digest goldenrod pollen. So that keeps them limited to goldenrod pollen gets delivered to goldenrod. This bumblebee is a major pollinator of lupin. You see the blossom here. Here's the lower lip. She's heavy. She lands on the lower lip, opens up the blossom, and she gets access to the food within. So goldenrod pollen gets delivered to goldenrod, clover to clover. We get clover honey. In fact, if goldenrod gets delivered to clover, it might just gum up the work. So not a good outcome. So a pretty neat trick, buzz pollination. It's unique to bumblebees and a few other native bees. Grabbing onto a flower. Here's a cranberry in our garden. We have a little cranberry bog that we created. Grabbing onto a flower, they vibrate pollen loose with a very audible buzz. Bumblebees are pretty quiet when they work, unless it's buzz pollination. You can really hear buzz pollination going on. Bumblebees pollinate flowers that have pollen really hard to access. Blueberries, cranberries included, and tomatoes. They're super efficient tomato pollinators. Tomatoes lack nectar, so they're not going to attract a lot of pollinators or a lot of insects. They self-pollinate. However, if they cross-pollinate, courtesy of a bumblebee going from one flower to another or one plant to another, the fruit is much more robust, vigorous, healthy, bigger. So the bad news, This is our most common bumblebee in New Hampshire, Bombus impatiens. Our most common bumblebee is raised and shipped to tomato greenhouses well beyond their own range, their home range, which is the east. They're shipped to Europe, and they experience the same stressors as honeybees do: overcrowding, transport, single crop food diet, and some escape. If they pick up pathogens, there's pathogen spillover to wild bees. A New Hampshire Audubon field trip Carl and I went to Coos County to the north, birds, New Hampshire Audubon, but we came across a colony of narrow-leaved gentians, and there was this bumblebee at work on these flowers. And here she just emerged from one, and she peeled the petals apart to go headfirst down into this one. It closed behind her, a lot of buzzing. Bzz. So whether there was buzz pollination going on there, I don't know, but it was noisy. And then here she's beginning to back out, and she's backed out. I don't know if her saddlebag is fuller, but we watched her, 8 birders surrounding this bee, so busy. She ignored us. It was a treat. When you observe nature in the backyard or beyond, not logical questions, I love the questions. So here's a question. Why do some plants make extracting pollen so difficult that only certain bees, usually bumblebees, big and strong, can pollinate them? So if you think back to plant visitors and plant pollinators, that's a clue. It takes a lot of energy, plant energy, to produce nectar and pollen. They're only producing that to attract pollinators. And they don't want visitors to come and rob. They don't want robbers. They don't want pollen and nectar robbers. They want to make sure that it's going to be a pollinator, not a visitor. So they make it difficult that only certain native bees will get their pollen. Here's evolution again. Coevolution, plant and its pollinator. Native plants and their primary pollinators, this gentian and this bumblebee, have co-evolved over millennia, always working on their relationship. So honeybees and native bees as pollinators, or honeybee, one species, and native bees, many, as pollinators. Honeybees, they're gorgeous. They're tidy feeders, meaning that they're transporting, with one result, they transport less pollen blossom to blossom. They have short tongues. More about that later. They forage up to 2 miles from their fixed hive position. And so that's a lot of time commuting. And also because they have a food source within their hive, they can remain in lousy weather, wet, cold, spring weather in particular. They can stay in the hive and with their stored food. Here's a messy, here's a messy bumblebee. They nest close to their favorite plants, a lot less time commuting. And there's a diversity of native bees, 200, over 200 in New Hampshire, sizes, shapes, and a diversity of tongue lengths, which matches the diversity of flower shapes and sizes. So exclamation points, tongue length's a big thing, important. They lack stored food, so they forage in wet, cold weather. Some states with big cash crops, blueberries in Maine, blueberry pollinators, there are so many studies done in Maine about blueberry pollinators. And it's been determined that bumblebees visit twice as many blueberry flowers a minute than honeybees visit. And this is, I just mentioned bumblebees because they're big and easy to notice. A lot of the bees are small, so it is getting pretty repetitious on bumblebees. But what I'm saying about bumblebees is true about most native bees. They're really efficient. A lot of them specialize. They have flower constancy, so they don't have to relearn, okay, what flower am I going to go to now? No, I'm going to stay with the same one. Highly efficient. And then in Oregon, cherries are a big crop there, and bumblebees are active twice as many hours a day. They start earlier and they are at work later. So European settlers, colonizers, they arrived with domesticated bees and beekeeping skills. The honeybee was really essential to early colonial life. It's a pollination generalist, not a specialist. Short tongues seem to work for most crop varieties. You can move a hive crop to crop, season to season, produce wax for candles, important back then, 400 years ago, and honey. Native bees. In the North America, some 4,000 species. They got the pollinating job done before the European honeybee arrived. And this is a distinction that's pretty important. Honeybees are a very important they have a very important agricultural role. They have very little ecological role, which is maintaining natural systems. So we've got a couple gray slides here. Maybe 5 years ago, we started reading about insect apocalypse. In 2018, New York Times Magazine featured, they had insects all over the cover, and they delved deeply into what was going on with insects. National Geographic, the same thing. They had an issue, I don't know if it was, anyway, they focused a couple times, more than once, on insects. And down here in the caption, bees, butterflies, and other insects are under attack by the very plants they feed on as US agriculture continues to use chemicals known to kill. Entomologists, they study the insects, as we all know. For a long time, they've talked about the windshield phenomenon. And I think maybe a lot of us have talked about, not that term, but we've noticed that our windshields have a lot fewer insects squished on them. And increasingly, studies are confirming the decline in insects. For bees, bumblebees, because they're big and observable, they're the ones most documented. Most species are in decline, and some are locally extinct, extirpated from their historic range. And so again, bumblebees are stand-in for all the other less observable bees. And we have maybe 10, well, we have fewer bumblebee species in New Hampshire than we used to. Well, we'll talk about that. So then there's a new, down here, insect Armageddon. New York Times has switched the insect apocalypse to insect Armageddon. And the conclusion of the editorial was, one thing is already clear, the fate of the world's insects is inseparable from our own. And it's more than pollinators, but pollinators certainly are among the most important. These pictures say it all. Almond orchard, California, as far as the eye can see, a monoculture, no edge habitat to support insects, pollinators. In central China, there's a fruit growing region, and they have no more pollinating insects, no more bees, and they attribute it to pesticides, and they're hand pollinating the pear trees here. Again, our iconic New England apple orchard with lots of, let's imagine that there's clovers and goldenrod and milkweed and good things there, and maybe some bare soil for nesting habitat. There is progress being made. There are some almond orchards that are planting pollinator plants, wildflowers amongst the rows and creating edge habitat. Progress is being made. All states, New Hampshire included, in order to get federal funding for conservation, wildlife conservation, you have to come up with a wildlife action plan. And New Hampshire came up with a really, really good one. And it has to focus on species of conservation risk. And our wildlife action plan points to changing agricultural practices that, just what we saw, create huge monocultures, herbicides to kill weeds. Those weeds happen to be food sources for pollinating insects, bees. Pesticides that, quote, directly kill or cause impairment in bees, and there's lots of studies that confirm that. Natural edge habitat for foraging and nesting. And transportation, honeybees and now bumblebees for crop pollination. Lots of stress, and again, the pathogens spill over. Climate disruption, climate warming, can throw off bloom times. Let's say a warm spring and the apple bloom early. The blue orchard bee emerges later on, and resulting in inadequate food for the blue orchard bee and less pollination of the apple orchard. Drought withered plants, pesticides, not just in agriculture, but in greenhouses, raising plants, and in backyards. In fact, I've heard that in California, there's more pesticides used in non-agricultural applications, meaning residential and commercial. So what can we do? Here's our second most common tricolored bumblebee and a honeybee and butterfly weed in the Harris Center Pollinator Garden. Feed them. Spring, summer, fall. Juneberry, really early wild. Amelanchier is the other name. And serviceberry has lots of names. Here's foam flower that's in the Harris Center Pollinator Garden. Pussy willows, the native pussy willow, look at all this pollen. Go to a native pussy willow when it's producing pollen and you'll see lots of activity. Summer, milkweeds, lots of milkweed. Here's a swamp milkweed in the Harris Center Pollinator Garden. Bumblebee. I don't know what this bee is. I'm not good at BID. My new favorite, New Jersey tea, and a native honeysuckle, great shrubs. Asters come in so many varieties, some like shade, some like sun, different soils, huge variety. Same with goldenrod, many varieties, sunshade, soils. Oh, we have a wonderful blue stem goldenrod just planted in the pollinator garden at the Harris Center. It's gorgeous. People blame goldenrod for fall allergies. Remember when I said that pollen that's transported by bees, insects, tiny grains, they're not airborne. It's another allergen that, so don't blame, just enjoy goldenrod. Don't blame it for sneezing. Boneset, we're about to plant in the pollinator garden. It's, I have it here in our gardens. It's an amazing pollinator magnet. House them. Most native bees, meaning non-honey bumblebees, are solitary bees. One female produces a brood on her own, far too busy to sting anyone. The first slide, we showed the pollen ball in the brood cell. She lays eggs in cells that she provisions with a pollen ball that the larvae feed on. 75% of bees are ground nesting bees, bumblebees included. She's excavated. These are different designs. And here's a brood cell. There's a pollen ball, not much left of it because the larvae is big and has eaten most of it. Here's a smaller one with a young larvae or an egg laid on it. This somehow she'll waterproof before she departs, her job done. She'll waterproof either the brood cells or the whole thing. I've worried about ground nesting bees, thinking of floods and things. Not to worry. Oh, so the caterpillars larvae will become pupae. They'll spend the winter as pupae, and then they'll emerge in the growing season when their favored food resources are blooming. 25% are cavity nesters, pithy stems. Here's a leafcutter bee. She'll make brood cells and separate them. She'll cut very tidy little circles out of a leaf, and she'll separate the brood cells with leaves. Other species with sawdust or mud. This pollinator garden has a stump, a big stump mounted in it, and some drill holes, probably by the gardener, and as well as some little beetle tunnels, and bees will nest in all of those. Lack of nesting habitat can be a limiting factor. So bare ground, they'll look like anthills on bare ground, but bare ground is important nesting habitat. Don't kill them. 7 years ago, selecting plants for the Harris Center Pollinator Garden, we learned about neonicotinoids called neonics. Systemic, meaning it impacts the entire organism. Neurotoxin. Banned in some countries, the EU, European Union, Canada, and some towns, a fair number of towns in Connecticut. Portsmouth tried to, but we're not a home rule state, and I think I know the effort didn't succeed, and I think that was a reason, not sure. It's a standard lawn treat for grubs, and it's been tied to agricultural applications and die-offs of nearby bees. So these are all true green. In New Hampshire, you have to post if you put toxic chemicals, treatments on lawn, you have to post it for 48 hours, and you have to circle what chemicals were used. And here, imidacloprid was circled, and that's the most popular neonicotinoid. And it's a standard, it's a grub control, it's standard. And I've talked to a couple of these landowners, they had no idea that on their lawns, a chemical toxin that's been banned in Canada and the EU. I don't want to be the only people talking to landowners. Come on along. Good news, most growers, we learned, planting the garden, have stopped using neonics for garden plants. Here's a fellow in, actually he went out of business, but I love this sign. He was so proud, no neonicotinoids. So the word is spreading. True Winners, a very popular grower, stopped using neonics just about when we were planting the garden. So that was 7-8 years ago. So progress. This is continuing the theme of what we can do. Doug Tallamy, famous for this book, but for other reasons too. So he's a professor at the University of Delaware. He's got lots of graduate students. And they have surveyed trees, shrubs, wildflowers for how many, pretty much moth and butterflies, but how many wildlife species the trees, the plants benefit. Black cherry is, I think, comes in number 2. 456 species of native moths and butterflies lay their eggs on, there's a broad number of cherry species, but black cherry is wonderful. You can know, very recognizable. It looks like burnt potato chips. That's how I learned to ID it. look at wonderful for pollinators and the favorite bird, cedar waxwings of many people. Oaks are the all-time winners, 534. So what does that mean? Moths and butterflies lay their eggs on certain plants. Oaks have tannins, I think we know that, and that's to deter browsers. That's how they do it. They have this chemical that makes their leaves undigestible to a whole lot of species. Cherry has cyanide, same reason. So if you co-evolve an animal with a plant, some are able to develop an ability to tolerate tannins or cyanide or the other chemical protectors. We have planted in our new house here 2 Doug Tallamy oaks in his honor. They also surveyed introduced plants. Burning bush euonymus, very popular landscaping choice. They found 2 species paid attention to this. Forsythia, 1 species. No shared history, no coevolution. And burning bush is one of the first plants that was put on New Hampshire's invasive species list. It's a very carefully curated list, and you cannot buy it, sell it, propagate it, transport it. I don't think it was a Doug Tallamy graduate student that determined that it takes over 6,000 caterpillars to raise 1 chickadee clutch, and it's a little inchworm, perfect food, soft, nutritious. But a Doug Tallamy graduate student, when there would be a chickadee nest failure, she surveyed the chickadees' typical habitat territory size for native plants, and usually she found very few. And the conclusion drawn was that if you don't have cherries, oaks, etc., the chickadees aren't going to do well. And here's a slide from Doug Tallamy presentation. Here's a big bird feeder that I think is probably an oak tree, and here's a cherry tree. Willows are very big, and then down the scale, some probably native viburnums. There should be some goldenrod here. A little too much lawn. Doug Tallamy is not a fan of lawn, so this is a bit of an odd, but it makes a point. If you want to feed the birds, plant native species. Please watch this video. You can spend hours and hours and hours reading the book, but it all comes home in 75 minutes of Doug Tallamy. He's very entertaining. He's very lively. And when I watched this video, I got it finally, understanding that native plants are important. So, homework. I did this invasive plants brochure a number of years ago for the Monadnock region. Of the over 30 invasive plants in the state, I selected 12 or 13 of the worst. I don't know if it's Doug Tallamy that said that if you plant I don't know, I won't pick out some exotic, but it's like opening up a restaurant that takes prime real estate downtown and doesn't serve any food. So I sort of like that analogy. Anyway, back to, so here's a burning bush. It's a colonized river shoreline here in town. Here's if you like that color, plant a blueberry. And this is my husband's prize-winning blueberry pie here. So they're available at the Harris Center, Peterborough Townhouse, no charge. Monoculture, this is garlic mustard. It self-pollinates, so it's not delivering any pollen or nectar to wildlife. It comes in on a roadside fill, most commonly. It also secretes a chemical that depresses other species, trees, the forest around it. It's easy to pull up. That's the only good thing about garlic mustard. Monoculture or biodiversity. I mean, look at that wonderful. This is what nature wants to do. This is one of the over 100 species that live, that digest. It's a moth, calico moth, of a fairly nondescript. It's a calico caterpillar of a fairly nondescript moth. A pretty neat trick: when a moth comes to goldenrod to lay eggs, she lays down some pheromone, a scent or a chemical that will tell other moths, oh, someone's already laid eggs on this, lots of eggs on this goldenrod. So I'm going to find a goldenrod that doesn't have pheromone on it. Because if all moths laid so many eggs on one poor goldenrod, they'd destroy their food source. So nature's amazing. Non-bees. There's so many stories out there about mutualism, a species, a plant, and its pollinator. Mutualism, joint benefit, good health. Here's our ruby-throated hummingbird, probably a youngster or a female. What's going on here? On the forehead, something's going on here. She's plunging her bill deep in to get nectar. Here, she's after nectar, not pollen. So, okay. Turns out cardinal flower has male, cardinal flower plant has male flowers. Here's where the pollen comes from. It'll be on this kind of hairy male anther. And it has female stigmas, kind of sticky. So here's a stigma. This hummingbird might have been at a male plant picking up pollen and then plunges deep in there, and the sticky stigma picks up the pollen here, and pollination has begun. So cardinal flowers are red. Hummingbirds see red really well. They're tubular shape, perfect match for the bill of a hummingbird. Hummer's forehead touches the anther, receives pollen. Female flower sticky stigma is positioned to collect the pollen. Cardinal flowers bloom in late summer, and that's when hummingbirds have to double their weight to fuel up for migration. So they go into this absolute feeding frenzy. The breeding season is over, and they are feeding, and that's when cardinal flowers bloom and need pollinators. They have the same similar range, so that's not coincidental. There are lots of stories out there, and we know some of them. This is a favorite one that I just learned. New Hampshire Audubon has a wonderful pollinator garden. Here's the entrance here. Diane DeLuca is the overseer, team of volunteers. It's worth a visit. So what I learned last summer visiting the garden is that we have 3 wonderful yellow loosestrifes, native plants. Here they are. What I learned from Diane is they produce a floral oil, not nectar, and a floral oil just sounded like yuck. So how is that going to be pollinated? And I hope you can guess the answer. Oil bees. There's a genus of bees that only can digest pollen and oil, not nectar. That's what they feed on. And so if you want to help this genus of bees, you help the wildflowers there. And Diane is going to give me, I think it's fringe loosestrife that she has a lot of. I'm not sure. It reseeds. And so I'm going to get some from my gardens here, and maybe for the Harris Center if they work out. All right, we're nearing the end, and we're going to challenge you with this slide. Pollinators versus pollination systems. Communicated in a way that will pain most of us. So if you're ready for a little bit of pain, Let's try and decipher this slide here. What's going on? Well, here's cardinal flower, hummingbird, going, hard to tell whether it's a male or female flower. There's the male flowers there. There's a female hummingbird here on bee balm. Hummingbird here on spotted touch-me-not, also called jewelweed. So that's all nature. Here is an introduced species or introduced object, hummingbird feeder. And there's all sorts of introduced honeysuckles that are on the invasive species list. They take over the understory, just the way burning bush does. So here's an arrow going down, suggesting that these systems are going down. And these systems are going up. And unfortunately, and I don't understand this, foraging preference seems to be for the non-natural, non-native. So I don't know why that is. It seems to me that the way things work, they should be preferring what they've evolved with, but I believe it. So conserving pollinators, we might put up a feeder and we think, oh, we're conserving the pollinators, or we might plant some honeysuckle and say, oh, we're helping the pollinators, but it's the pollination systems that are important. And so co-evolved here, introduced. My first talks years ago, I said, save the pollinators, and then learning this fairly recently, it saved pollination systems. And it was Rob Gageer, a talk he gave at New Hampshire Audubon, that brought this home to me. So here's a pollination system. How should I change things? Up here, add high impact native plants first. So here's a high impact native plant: Carolina rose, Virginia rose, swamp rose, all wonderful natives. Very popular with bees. The apple sphinx moth will lay eggs on roses, creating inchworms that feed all sorts of birds. This is a rather large one. Maybe some of the larger birds would take that size. The apple sphinx moth is food for eastern whippoorwill, which is on New Hampshire's endangered species list. Pollinated blossoms become rose hips, which feed all sorts of, these are exclusively birds, but there's other wildlife that would feed on them. So here's a pollination system. So we landscape to support native diversity with benefits well beyond the bees. So we've moved beyond bees here. I read in the Keene Sentinel a couple weeks ago a term wildscape instead of landscape. And I thought, well, that's cool. I'm not going to use it, but it's a nice indication that people are catching on. So it's really beyond the pollinator garden. Yes, we've got a wonderful demonstration garden at the Harris Center in New Hampshire Audubon, but landscaping beyond is something we can do that the wildlife need. What I'm learning. My first pollinator garden at our old house, plant selection. I'd go to a nursery, Agway or a roadside, and I just hang out and watch different plants, and the ones that attracted the most pollinators, I'd plant them. I'd buy them and plant them. I was rewarded by a giant swallowtail came to visit, more than one actually, different years. Very rare. It's a southern species, and an even rarer pipe vine swallowtail did too. Very rare in New Hampshire, very rare in Massachusetts. So I thought, oh, my pollinator garden really is too cool. It rocks. When I'm learning pollinator landscaping in our new house. I started with a pollinator garden, and then all of a sudden I thought, wait, what about shrubs, and what about out there? So plant selection goal has become native and a straight species. What's a straight species? This is another Rob Gagir slide. He's pretty black and white. Avoid native cultivars. He's a he's very strict. And so here's a study of cardinal flowers again. Nectar, quality of nectar, volume of nectar of a straight species, Lobelia cardinalis, as opposed to a cultivar. Cultivars are created to have bigger blossoms or more scent or disease resistance, but often at the expense of producing pollen and nectar. You can tell a hybrid, a straight species has the Latin binomial genus species, and a cultivar will have the Latin, but then it'll have in quotation marks a cute name, fan scarlet. So that indicates a non-straight species. Doug Tallamy, the great, he says it's probably the most common question he's asked. Do I do straight species or do I do cultivars? And he says some cultivars deliver the goods just as well as straight species. But he says, why not go with what nature created? So he's not as strict as Rob Gagir. So he says, shoot for 80% or so native. That's the reverse of what typically is out there. So if you're landscaping, the Harris Center pollinator garden is not 100% native straight species. 80%, I don't know. We haven't done the math. But we're making progress. Here's resources. Number one, Native Plant Trust. It used to be called the New England Wildflower Society, and then they caught on that it's all about native plants, so they changed their name. They have an awesome website. They're Massachusetts. Membership, join. They've got recommended plant lists for wildlife and pollinators, demonstration garden in the woods in Framingham. They grow and sell natives from seed at Nasami Farm in, I don't know how to pronounce, Whately, Massachusetts. Educational programs and more. And I went maybe 3 weeks ago, I went to Nasami. It was like a pilgrimage. This is early season. They're not quite ready yet. I took a picture, but I must have zapped it. Just tables and tables and tables of wildflowers and shrubs and trees. And here they are propagating from seed. It's amazing. You can also buy some of their plants at Garden in the Woods. So Doug Tallamy resources, must see. He's all over YouTube, but the main Audubon talk is so good. He also gave a great talk at New Hampshire Audubon, but we didn't tape it. Rob Gagir. You can see his talk, New Hampshire Audubon. It's called Exploring Connection series on YouTube. He is a techie. Doug Tallamy is enormously entertaining, but you come away from both with a lot of great stuff. Here's where to get native perennials and shrubs. Bagley Pond. Rob Gagir, Lincoln, Massachusetts as a town has this huge program to bring pollination systems awareness to townspeople. I don't think there's any other town that equals them. Rob Gagir consults with them. Bagley Pond, they have plant sales, native plant sales, and Bagley Pond Perennials supplies a lot of plants for that sale, as does Nasami Farm. So these are other ones. I've ordered some things, plugs, small versions from Northeast Pollinator Perennials. Visit the Harris Center Pollinator Garden, Hancock, New Hampshire Audubon Pollinator, and there's demonstration. I know some people by Zoom aren't locals, All areas have demonstration pollinator gardens. One last end note. This is such a video of one man who was beguiled by rusty-patched bumblebee. It used to be common in New Hampshire. It's not been seen in a couple decades. It's a video of his quest to find the rusty-patched. And it has a lot of information about what the issues are and what some solutions are. It's 19 minutes, I think. No, I don't know. Highly recommended. So we've come full circle. And I'm sort of within the time limit. But I'm happy to engage with anyone in conversation or excitement. It's what I'm about these days. But I think I'm going to go back to this resources page for you to look at. So Brett, I think I'm done. I don't know how to wrap it up, but I'm in love with bumblebees, my garden. I'm in love with my garden. I really feel like I have concerns and I'm taking steps to address those concerns. And I've never had such satisfaction gardening. And I think, sure, COVID isolation, I think a lot of us have turned to our gardens, but come visit. We have no lawn. We have a lot of bare patches for nesting bees. We're just not into a lawn, but we have lots of wild flowers and shrubs and trees going on. So thank you, Harris Center, for the invitation.
Thank you, Francie. And thanks to all of our pollinator gardeners too, Francie and Jean and all the others. That space is so beautiful. It's such a place of solace and beauty for not just for the bees and the hummingbirds and the butterflies, but for all the people who come and sit there, which happens all the time. So thank you all so much. I think we have maybe I'll ask one question. Most of your questions were already answered, but there was a question about mason bees and whether how they fit in with this big pollinator spectrum. How do they fit into the scheme of pollination? Jill said, I've heard they're great pollinators, but I've only ever seen them on, she says flowing oregano. I'm thinking she means flowering oregano in her garden. Do you have any words on mason bees before we completely wrap up?
Yeah, mason bees, I'm not sure if the blue orchard bee is a mason bee. I'm not sure. I'm not good at the divisions, but I know that especially Maine blueberry growers are exploring with making nesting. Their mason bees are cavity nesters, not ground nesters, and they're the ones that separate their brood cells with clay and grit, and I think that's why they're called mason bees. But they are very efficient pollinators, and the blue orchard bee has just been studied a lot, so that's just one example of a specialist, and the mason bees also are specialists, and I don't know what genus they specialize on, but growers, not the big huge industrial growers, but the smaller farmers, growers are exploring not only creating good foraging habitat, but they're also putting up tubular nesting colonies, clusters near their blueberries.
Okay.
I'm a generalist. I'm like a honeybee. My information is very generalist.
Courtney, who's in our audience, who knows a lot about insects, confirmed that blue orchards are indeed mason bees. So we've got confirmation on that part.
Good.
All right. Well, I think we're over time a bit, so I think we'll wrap up. But Thank you so much, Francie, and thank you to everyone for joining us. And I think we should all be getting out there into our gardens and start growing some flowers for the bees. So thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you out there in the garden sometime.